Burke Ramsey also testified. According to police documents, he listened to the 911 call, and although he would not admit that he was in the kitchen when his mother made the 911 call, he told the jurors that it sounded like his voice on the tape.
You were not concerned about Burke? Did you check Burke?
Yes,
we checked him fairly quickly.
The Ramseys, okay, police are there, friends come over. What happened to Burke? Does he stay asleep or do you wake him up and send it? What happens to Burke?
Burke was in bed. We got him up, don't remember what time, but we had him go to a friend's house. I told him his sister was missing.
Told him the truth.
Told him the truth. We didn't try to make...
He listened to the 911 call. He told the jurors that it sounded like his voice on the tape.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is the fourth episode analyzing slips in the Ramsey's first interview with Larry King in March 2000. If you followed the first three, you probably have some idea how we think about this case, right? So instead of providing all 5 slips on a platter, what I want to do in this one is test your critical thinking muscle. I want to test your critical thinking skills. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the next 5. But as we do, I want to see if you can see where the potential slip-up is before the explanation.
Worth playing for? Yeah.
Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So in each case, please stop the video, leave a comment, and then see if your comment lines up with the assessments of others as well as mine.
And here we go.
Number 1, we thought we were dealing with a kidnapping. You don't know whether you're going to see your daughter. What is strange here? Well, let's listen to that audio and video in John's own words.
Oh, absolutely. We thought we were dealing with a kidnapping.
Fearing the worst.
Police arrived.
Absolutely. You don't know whether you're going to see your daughter in an hour, in a day, in a year, in 10 years, or never.
So what is strange about this? I'll give you a second to pause the video and answer the question. What's strange here? It's gone from first person to second person. Now you might think that's not a big deal. It's not a big deal saying at one point we thought we were dealing with a kidnapping, and then immediately after that you don't know whether you're going to see your daughter. Instead of we thought we were dealing with a kidnapping, we didn't know whether we were going to see our daughter. Now, again, you might think that's not really a big deal at all, but think about the psychology of this situation in more detail. Because if the ransom note is staged, then the ransom note was contrived to look like a second person, an additional person. And then if it was staged, then someone is thinking in terms of what would another person think given this situation, this false situation. And that's when it becomes you don't know, they don't know whether this is going to happen or not. And so think about it in that respect. And so here in this interview, you have John not talking about, I don't know about my daughter, or we don't know about my daughter, but you don't know about your daughter. Isn't this about their daughter? And if the person who wrote the ransom note wasn't an intruder, think about what is going on here. Someone else writing, we have your daughter. Now imagine if the person writing about that is a relation of JonBenet writing about somebody else. We have your daughter. Just think about that idea. Then number 2, pure agony, sheer horrifying terror. Now let's listen to that from, in their own words, John and Patsy's words.
What are you going through at this point?
Agony.
Agony.
Sheer, horrified terror.
So, did you catch that? Larry asks, what were you going through at this point? What was going on inside of you? What were your thoughts? What were your feelings? What were your emotions? Now, we do know what Linda Arndt said about John seeming to go through his mail. He was tapping his foot. She also described him as cordial. And this may be very unfair, and let's face it, it is subjective. But we're up to 7.5 minutes into this interview, and there doesn't seem to be any grief. There are no tears from Patsy. There's no sense of real trauma. Certainly there are words, the right words, but you don't really see Patsy wiping tears away, Patsy being overcome. Instead, there's a sort of defensive indignation. That's where the emotion is. There's a lot of verbal jousting. That's where the emotion is. When it's discussions about, did you cooperate? That's where the emotion is. And that reminds me of something that John Ramsey said once on Dr. Phil, which I found a pretty incredible admission. Listen to this.
The real story here is not that a child was murdered. The real story here is what was done to us by an unjust system.
Now, I don't know about you, but that to me registers completely inappropriately. This is not the story of what happened to JonBenet. This is not about a little girl who lost her life. It's about us, really. And if you take that at face value, then you say, is that the right way to deal with this case emotionally? It's not about her, it's about me. It's not about what actually happened to her or who committed this crime. It's the crime that was done to us, really. I mean, in my opinion, that is just very inappropriate emotion. And so when John says pure agony and Patsy says sheer horrifying terror, yes, those are the right words, but do those words ring true otherwise? For example, in this interview with Dr. Phil, how on earth can you say something like that? And is the pure agony about losing a child or about something else, having a ransom note and possibly getting into trouble around that? And so, again, I will acknowledge this is a tough one, and it's not necessarily simple or straightforward. But probably the simplest way of putting this across is this simple question. Are the Ramseys emotionally compromised? Were they emotionally compromised?
Jim, I just lost my planet. I can tell you, I am emotionally compromised.
When emotional trauma is real, it is mirrored by emotional compromise. And I think it's fair to say, to the degree that it's real, you have a mirror of emotional compromise. Some people can't even function because of this. And again, this is definitely a slippery area, because you could say some individuals do have the ability to act with clarity and alacrity, with purpose and resolve, even in situations that would render most of us paralyzed with anxiety or nervousness. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a departure, but just indulge me for a moment. I have a memory as a young kid, although I was a fast runner, when I crouched down to do the 100-meter sprint, I could feel my heart exploding in my chest to such an extent my legs felt weak. They kind of felt spongy. That feeling I wanted of being able to grip the ground and to clench my muscles was very hard to do when your legs felt kind of wobbly with nerves. And I would invariably come second in those races year after year, but it was always a test of mind over matter, focus and concentration over feelings. And it was one that I often felt I was losing. And yet some people do it effortlessly. Now, it doesn't mean that they aren't emotionally compromised. It just means that they have the ability to concentrate, right? And so that is another aspect to it. But can someone concentrate moments after someone very, very close to them, their own child, dies? John was a CEO and Patsy a pageant queen and cancer survivor. And so how does that question apply to them? Because a CEO of a big company that's just made $1 billion in turnover, that's a high-stress environment. A pageant is a very high-stress environment as well, where you've got to function despite all of this nervousness. And so the reason this question seems important is because we'd expect John and Patsy to be emotionally compromised. But are they? They seem to handle the police investigation slickly and cleverly. And whether they are innocent or not, let's face it, they ultimately beat the charges against them. I don't think that's because they were emotionally compromised, but because they weren't. I've lost a family member, someone very close to me, and a very close friend, a best friend. Agony and terror are the right words to describe what I went through and what the Ramseys went through. But why don't we see that emotion here? You know, it's many years since I lost these people close to me, and it still gives me pause. It's still tough not to get emotional. Now, again, you might say this is something of a misnomer, but I would say if there wasn't an intruder, the most appalling thing about the Ramsey case is the idea that when presented with the death of their own child, was someone able to muster the emotional distance to write a not 1 or 2 page note, but a 3-page note, imaginative, confounding, even with a sense of humor. You know, don't grow a brain, John, use that Southern common sense, snatching inspiration from movie quotes with the psychological dexterity and lucidity of a psychopath. Is that what we're dealing with here? It really does seem far-fetched. It does seem improbable. It does seem unlikely. It is hard to believe. Is that what we're dealing with here? So again, the question comes up, was the agony really so pure and the terror so horrifying?
No. What are you going through at this point?
Agony.
Agony.
Sheer, horrified terror.
For me, and this is just my opinion, the slip here is just a possibility of one. And if it's there, it reveals itself through a mismatch. Words versus emotions. Words versus actions. Ransom notes versus reality. Pageantry and pretense versus very real thoughts and feelings. And before we get to number 3, I just want to remind you that a new JonBenet Ramsey limited series is coming to Paramount Plus. And what they're trying to do in that series is have actors Melissa McCarthy and Clive Owen basically represent, recreate, reenact how the parents came across suspiciously. That is quite an indictment of the whole thing, is that today, almost 30 years later, if you're going to recreate the Ramsey story, then you need to get actors who are going to act in such a way that you're going to say, whoa, I'm not sure if I accept what is being said. I'm not sure if I believe what's going on. And true or false, rightly or wrongly, that is the very real legacy of the Ramsey case of JonBenet's parents. And that brings us to number 3. Your daughter is in the hands of a monster. You don't know where. You don't know if she's cold. Now, yes, this is a repeat of the shifting of the whole experience from first person to turning it into a second person narrative. That's not really what I want to focus on here. But before we deal with it, let's listen to it in their own words.
Your daughter is in the hands of a monster. You don't know where. You don't know if she's cold, if she's... You just don't know. It's a horrible feeling for her.
Now, I've personally never liked John saying that when he found JonBenet, he felt relief. I've just never liked that. I've just always found it strange. But anyway, it's interesting that John seems to express it and then think of it in the way that he does. Right? But he also slips up, in my opinion, in another way. Patsy has just described the terror they are going through, and then John volunteers. He contributes this next bit off the top of his head. Look at the words he chooses when he could choose any words. He chooses the word hands, first of all, and he actually puts his hands on the table side by side when he does that. He role plays with his own hands.
Your daughter is in the hands of a monster?
Well, actually she wasn't. His daughter was in the basement, and we don't know, technically we don't know, or certainly they say they've got no idea who it is. And so whoever left JonBenet where she was left actually wrapped her in a blanket. And according to the ransom note, none of it was personal. It was like, we have your daughter, and if you give us money, we'll give her back to you. So what that seemed to suggest is something else that was going on. Someone who perhaps had a grievance against John's business. So according to the merits of the ransom note writer is actually prepared to take care of JonBenet in exchange for money. But what I find interesting is that hands definitely played an unusual role in what happened to JonBenet, right? Duct tape was placed over her mouth. She had to be carried. Her clothes were changed. She was apparently wiped down. There are lots of other elements that involved hands tying things and all that sort of thing. Hands constructing things. And then John also volunteers another word, the word where. He says, besides your daughter is in the hands, he says where. You don't know where.
Your daughter is in the hands of a monster? You don't know where?
And the where is a big part of the mythos of this case, was that where was JonBenet? Well, the ransom note suggested she was somewhere unknown. Meanwhile, where was she? She was actually in the house all that time. The where was quite an important aspect. Where definitely played an unusually prominent role in what happened to JonBenet. Also, where did whatever happen to JonBenet? That's an aspect that's very seldom thought about. If JonBenet was deliberately hidden, then you can imagine when the police arrived, whoever hid her there are going to feel
Agony. Sheer, horrified terror.
But is that because of what's been done to JonBenet, because of what they or whoever has staged the crime has done, and the fear of being found out? Is that the reason? If that's so, it's a totally different fear to the other fear. Let's face it, if that fear was present, it wasn't an irrational fear, because the grand jury ultimately found reasons to indict. But then there's also this word, besides hands and where, there's also this word cold. You don't know if she's cold.
In the hands of a monster? You don't know where? You don't know if she's cold, if she's...
Cold is an interesting word because it was cold. In fact, when Sergeant Reichenbach was on his way to the Ramsey home, he actually went past one of those pharmacy signs and it registered that it said 9 degrees Fahrenheit. That's really cold. And so JonBenet was cold, which is why it's quite interesting when John narrates in his book and when he speaks about it, he says that JonBenet wasn't cold but cool to the touch, which suggests that she died not a long time earlier.
I removed the tape immediately. I could feel that her skin was cool.
And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while.
It's just a very interesting turn of phrase. You don't know if she's cold. You don't know when this happened. Did it happen on the 26th or the 25th? You don't know. But what if you do? The other thing that's, and of course the pineapple provides some clue in that regard. The other thing that is worth thinking about is if the Ramseys did know where JonBenet was and they sat in that house for hours, then there was an incredible degree of patience and strategy and stealth. Think of the guile involved, which is scarcely believable. And actually, in this area, it makes the intruder theory actually seem more likely. But think of the guile potentially involved in deciding to deliberately outwit and outplay and outlast the cops. And then the question is, if that happened, did they succeed? Was that happening? And Is this the result?
Was she hidden in any way?
No.
Number 4, another great question from Larry King. Were you security conscious? What do you think the answer is to that?
Horrible feeling for
Did you ever fear kidnapping, being a fairly well-off person in a
it didn't occur to us.
Didn't have bodyguards.
So this is a really good question to pause and think about it. Larry asks so many great questions, but one has to wonder whether any of the cops, including his very next guest, Steve Thomas, gave Larry a few suggestions. And again, this may be a tough one to verify, but the man who installed the Ramsey security system said that they were security conscious. And they also seem very in control and able to secure access to their son, and very in control and able to secure their legal situation in the aftermath, and able to take control of the whole media narrative in the way that they did. In terms of security, an aspect that no one seems to remember is that the Ramseys were about to fly out of state and then go on a boat cruise. Were they really going to leave a broken window, which John knew was broken? He said he broke it. Were they going to leave that broken and the alarm off? Would you go on holiday leaving a broken window at your home and the alarm off? Anyway, that brings us to number 5. What happened to Burke? And then Burke was in bed, ...
Come over. What happened to Burke? Does he stay asleep, or do you wake him up and send it? What happens to Burke?
Burke was in bed.
So Larry's question is, what happened to Burke? Does he stay asleep? Now, what's interesting is how slow John starts talking here. He also doesn't answer the question about whether Burke was asleep or awake. And this would turn out to be a shifting narrative over time, starting off with him being asleep, and then on the 20th anniversary, Burke acknowledged that he was awake, but awake in bed, not awake to hear the phone call. Also, and you may not know this, Burke testified in front of the grand jury that it probably was his voice heard in the 911 call. And what that suggests is that Burke was more than just awake, and more than awake in his bed. He was ambulant the next morning before the police arrived. Have the Ramseys ever admitted that? And did they do so here? Now, I'm not going to take it further than that, except I want to just come back to this whole idea of the pageantry surrounding the grand jury. And the part that I think is easy to miss is you might say, well, maybe there was pageantry from Patsy's side. Maybe there was pageantry from John's side. What about pageantry from the district attorney's side? And so specifically, was this pageantry, this is from 34 minutes, 7 seconds from Dateline NBC's Who Killed JonBenet? Is this pageantry? Is this pretense? Is this acting in front of the cameras?
Soon there will be no one on the list but you. Everyone in America is watching.
Let's watch that again and just note how dramatic the language is and how dramatic the gestures are, and compare that to the mismatch of, oh, well, there's insufficient evidence. If there was insufficient evidence at the end of all this, why make such an assertive gesture on television at this point?
The list of suspects narrows. Soon there will be no one on the list but you.
And so you can't help wondering, were we deceived? Was this disingenuous? How many people in the story were disingenuous? Were the Boulder police disingenuous, or were other people disingenuous? Was the ransom note writer disingenuous? And I'm going to end off with this interview that John gave to Dr. Phil. And you remember what he was asked about, is this your last interview? And you remember how he answered. This is 37 minutes, 38 seconds into episode 6 from season 14 of Dr. Phil.
Do you think you'll ever speak about this again?
No. There's no point. I'm done. Yeah, period. They say you never should say never, but I'm pretty much saying never.
Well, we know that John Ramsey appeared with Paula Woodward at CrimeCon earlier this year, and I think it was his second or third appearance consecutively in 2 or 3 years. Thank you for listening. If you have participated in these 5 questions, or you've thought about them and you've provided your answers, thank you very much for doing that. Take care, enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you guys next time.